The transfer order arrived on a Tuesday, folded inside a manila folder that smelled like copied paper and institutional indifference. Fia Brenner found it at the nurse's station at midnight, wedged beneath a supply requisition form as though whoever had left it couldn't decide whether it mattered. Room 14, Sergeant Emile Carrow. Transfer to Norwood State Psychiatric Institute. Effective 14 days pending attending physician signature. She read it twice, she set it back down, then she went to check his vitals. Room 14 was at the far end of the overnight wing at the Belmont Veterans Psychiatric Care Unit in Richmond, Virginia, the kind of hallway that hummed with fluorescent lights and the occasional beep of monitoring equipment and very little else. Emile Carrow had been in that room for 7 months. He'd arrived on a gurney from Fort Belvoir in early November, post-op from 2 surgeries, with a file that said Special Forces and a status that said non-responsive. His entire team had been listed K following a classified operation in the Balkans. He was the only survivor, found 3 days after the incident by a shepherd in a valley 12 miles from the exfil point. No one could explain how he'd gotten there. No one was trying anymore. The day staff called him a vegetable, not cruelly, more the way people say it when they've stopped hoping. Dr. Wexford, the attending psychiatrist, had documented persistent vegetative state secondary to traumatic brain injury in Emile's chart with the confidence of a man who had already moved on to his next case. The neurologist agreed. The transfer to Norwood had been brewing since February. By June, it had become inevitable. Norwood was a locked facility, long-term placement, indefinite. In practice, it was the kind of place a man went, and the door closed behind him, and no one asked questions about what happened after. Fia had been told, informally and then less informally, to accept it. She pushed open the door to room 14 and let her eyes adjust to the low light. Emile lay in the same position he always occupied. On his back, hands loose at his sides, face turned slightly toward the window. The window looked out onto a concrete parking structure. He stared at it the same way every night, as if there were something worthwhile beyond the gray face of that wall. She checked his IV line, noted his breathing, logged his vitals on the tablet without turning on the overhead light. She'd learned early on that bright light after midnight made him flinch, not dramatically, just a slight tightening around the eyes, and that the day staff had never noticed because they always came in with the overheads blazing. That was the thing about night shift. You saw differently. She had been watching Emile Carrow for 4 months, since transferring from the surgical floor. She'd cataloged things about him that weren't in any chart. The way he tracked movement in his peripheral vision without turning his head. The way his jaw tightened imperceptibly when the orderly named Brent came in too fast and too loud. The way his fingers, sometimes in the earliest hours of morning, traced small deliberate shapes against the bedsheet. Not random tremor, not the loose motor misfiring that Dr. Wexford called involuntary. Something intentional. A pattern she hadn't cracked yet. He was in there. She'd staked her professional instinct on it, quietly, where it didn't cost anyone anything yet. She was sitting in the corner chair at 2:15, filling out her notes when it happened. She did it without thinking. Her grandfather, her data, who'd emigrated to Richmond from Novi Sad when Fia was 3, used to say a particular phrase when she couldn't sleep as a child. He'd press his palm against her forehead and murmur it low, almost under his breath, the way you say something you've said so many times it's become reflex. She hadn't thought about it in years. But the room was very quiet, and her pen kept skipping on the tablet, and she found herself murmuring it without realizing she was doing it. Zaspavaj Mali, Misek Techuva. Sleep, little one, the moon is watching over you. Emile Carrow's eyes moved to her face. Not a slow drift, not the ambient flicker she'd documented as involuntary light response. His eyes moved with precision and with purpose, and they locked on to hers, and they stayed there. Fia stopped breathing for a moment. Then she did something her nursing training would not have endorsed, and her gut absolutely required. She put down the tablet. She leaned forward in the chair, and she said it again, softer, looking directly at him. Zaspavaj, Mali. His right hand moved, just his index finger lifting off the sheet and then pressing back down, once. It was the smallest possible acknowledgement. It was also the first voluntary communication Emile Carrow had made in 7 months. Fia sat with that for 30 seconds. Then she went back to the nurse's station and pulled his file. His deployment records were classified, or at least the operational details were. But the supporting documentation wasn't entirely scrubbed. Medical intake forms, pre-deployment psych evaluations, language aptitude assessments, the Army's D-Lab results documented in his personnel summary. Emile Carrow had scored in the 93rd percentile. His assessed language profile listed Croatian and Bosnian as functional working languages, both of which were, structurally and phonetically, close enough to Serbian that a child's lullaby in her grandfather's dialect had reached him through 7 months of silence. She stayed at the nurse's station until 4:30 in the morning, reading everything she was authorized to read and making very careful notes about what she couldn't access but needed to. She went back to room 14 at 5. She sat in the corner chair and she spoke to him, slowly. Broken, imperfect Serbian she'd largely forgotten and was partially reconstructing from memory. She told him she knew he could hear her. She told him she'd found the transfer order. She told him she had 14 days and she intended to use them. His breathing changed. Slightly. She would have missed it if she hadn't been watching his chest rather than his face. It deepened. Something in him settled the way a body settles when it's been holding a brace for a very long time and has finally been told it doesn't have to. When she got to the part about Norwood, the locked facility, indefinite placement, his jaw tightened. That same almost invisible tension she'd cataloged 50 times. But this time she understood it differently. This wasn't involuntary. This was a man who understood exactly what was being said to him and had just heard something that frightened him. Not the facility itself, she thought on her drive home. The timing. The transfer being moved forward. Someone wanting him somewhere unreachable before something happened. She went back over what she knew. Emile's unit had been declared KIA in November. The after-action report, the version in the documents she could access, was 3 paragraphs long and cited operational security as the reason for its brevity. His medical records showed surgical intervention for a penetrating chest wound and a left orbital fracture. The chest wound was documented as fragment injury, consistent with blast. But the orbital fracture was blunt force. Not shrapnel, not concussive proximity. Blunt force trauma to the left side of his face at the orbital rim. She was not a forensic specialist. She was a night shift nurse at a psychiatric care unit. But she'd done rotations in the ED, and she had seen a lot of faces, and there was a difference she'd learned to recognize between a face that had been near an explosion and a face that had been struck. She called in a favor. A friend from nursing school, Corinna Veld, who now worked records administration at the Walter Reed system. She asked whether Emile's pre-deployment baseline medical imaging had been included in any interfacility transfer documentation. Standard intake procedure. It should exist. Corinna called back in 3 days. The imaging existed. Fia requested it formally through Belmont's medical records department, citing the upcoming Norwood placement as clinical justification. Routine transfer of care documentation. The kind of request that generated a form letter and a 3-week wait under normal circumstances. The request was denied within 4 hours, not pending, denied, by someone above Dr. Wexford's signature authority. That was not how medical records worked. Fia sat with that at her kitchen table for a long time. She was not the kind of person who saw conspiracies in administrative friction. 4 years of hospital nursing had given her a thorough education in bureaucratic incompetence and paperwork for its own sake. But this was specific, this was fast, and it was targeted at a single patient's baseline imaging file, requested by a night shift nurse who had no institutional weight behind her name at all. Someone had been watching this patient's chart closely enough to catch a routine request in 4 hours and route it to a denial with unusual authority. Someone was paying attention to Emile Carrow's file, and they were not paying attention to it in any way that was good for Emile Carrow. She went back to room 14 that night and told him what had happened. His finger moved again, same gesture, index finger lifting, pressing back down, once, then after a pause twice. Yes. She watched his face while he did it. He was looking at her directly, and for the first time, she thought she could read what was in that gaze. Not the flat affect that the psych eval described, not the absence that Dr. Wexford had documented with such professional certainty. Something working very hard to communicate through a channel that had been shut down for 7 months. Something that had been waiting for the right frequency. "Someone doesn't want me to see it," she said in English, because her Serbian wasn't adequate for what she needed to say. "Your records from before. Someone blocked the request specifically." 2 taps. She knew an attorney. Lieutenant Colonel Adair. She'd treated his wife after a surgical complication 2 years before, and he'd pressed his card into both her hands with that quality of seriousness some people have when they genuinely mean what they're offering. She'd filed it in a box in her closet with the other things she never threw away, because you never knew. She dug it out. She called him from her car in the Belmont parking lot at 6:45 the following morning, before she drove home. She told him everything. He was quiet for a long time when she finished. Then he asked her 2 questions, whether she had the denial in writing and whether she had a witness to the communication from room 14. The denial she had. The system had auto-generated a response record. The communication, the finger movement, the eye contact, the documented index of small signals she'd been building for 4 months. She had no witness, only her notes, made in real time, in the room, with Emile watching. "That's enough to open an inquiry," Adair said. "Not a guarantee of anything, but it's a place to stand." She drove home. She slept 4 hours. She came back. The night that Adair's inquiry request reached the facility, Fia was doing rounds when Dr. Wexford appeared in the overnight hallway. It was the first time in 8 months she had seen him in this corridor after 9 in the evening. He told her he understood she had been making unusual requests regarding Sergeant Carrow's records. She told him she had identified anomalies in the documentation and sought clarification through appropriate channels. He told her that Emile Carrow had been evaluated by 4 independent specialists and that the prognosis was well established. He told her the transfer was in the patient's best interest. He told her, more carefully than anything else he said, that involving military legal offices in clinical decisions was outside the scope of a staff nurse's practice and could be interpreted as interference with patient care protocol. She thanked him for the guidance. She went back to room 14. She sat in the chair. She told Emile that someone had noticed what she was doing, that the window was narrowing. She'd checked the transfer order that afternoon. It had been moved forward. 8 days now, not 14. She told him, in as much Serbian as she could manage and English where she couldn't, that she needed something from him. Anything specific enough that Adair could use it. Emile was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought she'd lost him, that the silence was going to close back over him the way water closes over a stone. Then he spoke. 2 words, barely audible, the voice of a man who hadn't used his vocal cords intentionally in 7 months, rough and careful and deliberate, like someone lifting something heavy that they'd set down a long time ago. Message, Ljochar. A name. She didn't recognize it. She wrote it down phonetically in her notes right there in the room while he watched her hand move across the page. Then he said one English word. He said it clearly. Witness. She did not sleep that day. She called Adair from a parking lot 3 blocks from the hospital and gave him what she had. He told her to document everything she'd observed, maintain her normal routine, and not be in that hallway alone until he had spoken to someone. What Lieutenant Colonel Adair's inquiry uncovered over the following 72 hours was not the complete picture. That would take months and a separate federal investigation and testimony from 2 other members of Emile's unit who had not appeared on the KIA list because they had been quietly separated and relocated before any records could link them to the operation. But it was enough to freeze the transfer. It was enough to put a hold on Norwood. The name Emile had given her belonged to a local national intermediary who had been in custody when the operation's exfil went wrong, a civilian. A man with a wife and 2 children in a village that no American official had ever officially visited in connection with the mission. He had been executed, not in crossfire, not caught in a blast radius. 1 shot to the back of the head at close range. And Emile Carrow, the unit's medic, had been the only member of the team who had moved to stop it. The after-action report had listed him KIA alongside the others, because it was cleaner than explaining why the medic had been found alive and the civilian had not. The blunt force trauma, the orbital fracture she'd noticed in the records, the injury that didn't fit the documented narrative, was what it looked like when someone needed the only witness to something unconscionable to stop witnessing anything. Someone had falsified his pre-deployment baseline imaging, retroactively dated the orbital injury as pre-existing on file before deployment, so that his injuries in the field would appear consistent with blast exposure rather than with being struck deliberately by someone who needed him unconscious and out of the picture. It was a careful forgery, 7 months of careful maintenance, and then a night shift nurse had murmured a Serbian lullaby in a dark room, and the whole careful structure had begun to come apart. The transfer to Norwood was cancelled 11 days before its revised effective date. Fia found out when she came in for her shift, and Emile Carrow's chart carried a new status notation, clinical hold pending review. She walked down to room 14 and she told him. His eyes were already open when she pushed the door. He was watching the window, the same parking structure, but something about the angle of his face was different. The quality of the attention was different. Something had been set down. She said in the best Serbian she had, "They can't move you now." He turned his head toward her, fully. For the first time in 7 months, he turned his head and looked directly at her. He said, "I know." She sat down in the corner chair and pressed both hands flat on her knees to stop them from shaking. Recovery for Emile Carrow did not proceed the way it does in films. It didn't come in a flood. It was slow and non-linear. There were nights when he didn't respond to anything, and nights when he spoke in bursts. Serbian, Croatian, occasionally English, about things that Fia wrote down carefully and passed, with his knowledge and consent, to Adair and then to the Inspector General investigators who arrived quietly and without announcement 3 weeks after the hold was placed. It was a speech therapist named Pruitt who rebuilt the language pathways methodically over 8 months. It was a trauma specialist named Dr. Osi, 15 years working with conflict zone survivors, a researcher Fia had found through a contact and advocated for specifically by name in her review board filing, who built the therapeutic scaffolding around the wounds beneath the words. Fia was not in the room for most of that. She worked nights. She changed his IV bags and checked his blood pressure, and sat in the corner chair when the ward was quiet, and sometimes she spoke Serbian and sometimes she didn't say anything at all, and that was also enough. The civilian's name was entered into the federal record. His family was located. The name behind the falsified imaging, behind the call that had fast-tracked the denial of Fia's medical records request, was connected to a chain of command that the investigation described in language she was not given access to read in full. She was told only that it was ongoing and consequential, and she believed it because Adair told her, and she had learned to read the weight behind the things he chose to say carefully and the things he chose not to say at all. What she was told directly was this: without her documentation, without the formal records request that had generated the denial, without the phonetic notation she'd made in real time while Emile watched her hand, there would have been nothing specific enough to open. 7 more days and he would have been at Norwood, unreachable, and whatever he knew would have stayed locked inside him until it didn't matter anymore. She didn't know what to do with that. She went back to work. The question she couldn't stop asking was not about Emile. It was broader than Emile. How many others? How many men and women in locked wards and state facilities and long-term placements had been written off as non-responsive when what they actually were was unreachable, because no one had tried the right language, the right signal, the right frequency at the right hour? How many charts said persistent vegetative state when what they meant was no one had sat in the corner chair at 2 in the morning and paid attention to an index finger lifting a 1/4 inch off a bedsheet? She began writing things down. Not reports, not formally. Notes first, then something more structured. Observations about what she'd noticed before the Serbian lullaby, before she'd even known she was cataloging signals. She brought it to the unit director, who was skeptical but not dismissive. She brought it to the speech therapy department. She brought it to Dr. Osi, who was not skeptical at all. What became of it over the following 18 months was a formal assessment protocol, piloted at 3 VA facilities in Virginia and Maryland for patients in the non-responsive category. It was not a miracle. It didn't open every door, but it opened some of them. And the people it reached had been silent for months or years, inside rooms that smelled like disinfectant and institutional resignation, with staff walking past them who had decided that continued silence was an answer, rather than a question still waiting to be asked correctly. The protocol carried no name on its cover page. It was a clinical instrument, not a monument, but in the acknowledgement section, in the last 2 lines, a speech therapist named Pruitt had insisted on a single sentence that Fia had not objected to. This work began because one nurse on the night shift paid attention when no one was watching. Emile Carrow was discharged to an outpatient program in February, 14 months after his arrival at Belmont. He walked out through the glass doors on a Thursday morning, a week of cold rain that had broken into unexpected, tentative sun. Fia had finished her overnight shift and was in the parking lot, keys in her hand, when he came through. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her for a moment, the way a person looks at the place where something important happened, not with sentimentality, but with a kind of precise recognition. He said in English, and not quietly, "You were there every night." She said she had been. He said, "I knew you were there." She had wondered about that sometimes in the months since he'd started speaking again. Whether he'd known, during the long silent months, that she was the one in the corner chair. Whether one particular presence in a dark room had meant anything at all, or whether he had simply come back when the conditions were finally right and she had happened to be there. She had her answer now. She decided not to say everything she was thinking because some things were too large for a parking lot on a Thursday morning in February, with the sun coming in low and the air still cold enough to see your breath. She said, "I know you knew." He nodded once. The nod of a man for whom something that needed to be said has been said correctly, without excess. Then he walked to the car that was waiting for him, and she drove home through the bright cold morning, and the whole way there she thought about the other rooms, the other hallways, the other people lying in the dark, having made the quiet, devastating decision that no one left was going to hear them. She had 14 years before she could think about retirement. She thought she had a clear sense of how to fill them.